April 23, 1945. A prisoner processing center in Ludwigsburg, Germany. The morning air carries the smell of disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something rich and dark and utterly foreign. Steam rises from metal cups being handed through a wire fence. Anna Weber wraps both hands around the tin cup, feeling warmth for the first time in months. The liquid inside is black, almost intimidatingly so. She'd been told coffee was a luxury the Americans hoarded for themselves, that prisoners would get water and gruel and nothing more. But here she is, holding what an American soldier just called Joe. Her hands are shaking. Not from cold, from the cognitive dissonance of receiving kindness from conquerors. She lifts the cup to her lips. The smell hits her first bold, complex, nothing like the acorn and chicory substitute she'd been drinking for 3 years. Then the taste. Smooth, rich, real. Mena starts crying into the cup. Not because it's coffee, because she'd forgotten things could taste like anything other than survival. Good, right. The American soldier says in broken German, grinning. He can't be more than 20. He's treating her like a human being instead of enemy scum. And he's given her coffee like it costs nothing, like abundance. It's just the American way. What Anna did not know was that this cup of coffee, this single gesture of normalcy in the midst of catastrophe, was about to become her first lesson in what America actually meant. Not the propaganda version. Not the enemy she'd been taught to fear. But something more complicated and more generous than she'd ever imagined. For months, female prisoners across the American occupation zones had been whispering about the coffee. How the Americans drank it constantly. How they offered it freely. How they acted as if there was an infinite supply. As if rationing and deprivation and careful hoarding were concepts they'd never learned. In the German camps, where Anna had spent the last 6 months of the war working in a factory making uniforms for soldiers who were losing coffee, had been a memory, a ghost. Something that existed only in the past tense. The brown liquid they'd been given was made from roasted grain, burnt chestnuts, whatever could be ground and boiled to create the illusion of coffee. It tasted like desperation. Like defeat. Like everything good had been extracted from the world, and all that remained was substitution and pretense. But this American coffee, it tasted like a world where good things still existed, where abundance was possible, where the normal rules of scarcity didn't apply. They're trying to poison us. Anna's bunkmate Greta had said the first morning, refusing the cup. Or drug us. Or make Uswe coffee this good can't be free. There's always a price. But Anna had watched the American soldiers drinking from the same pot. Laughing. Casual. Taking second cups. Third cups. As if coffee was as common as water. As if they'd never learned that resources were supposed to be scarce. Carefully allocated. Strictly controlled. She drank. And the world shifted across occupied Germany. From Mannheim to Munich. From Stuttgart to Heidelberg. The same scene was repeating. American soldiers offering coffee to enemy prisoners, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Female prisoners taking that first sip and having the same reaction. Shock, gratitude, and the slow unraveling of everything they'd been taught about their enemies. How did a cup of coffee, a simple beverage, become the weapon that destroyed Nazi propaganda more effectively than any bomb? How did America's casual abundance become the most powerful argument against fascism as philosophy of scarcity and hierarchy? The answer wasn't in the coffee itself. It was in what the coffee represented, and what it revealed about 2 completely different ways of organizing society. 2 different philosophies about human worth. 2 different beliefs about who deserved good things and why. And it all started with that first shocking, revelatory, impossible to deny taste. To understand Anna's shock, we must go back to 1939, when coffee first became a weapon in a different kind of war. September 3rd, 1939. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Within weeks, the British Navy began blockading German ports. Coffee, which Germany imported entirely from abroad, became one of the first casualties. The Nazi regime responded with typical efficiency. Coffee was rationed, then rationed further, then replaced with ersatz, substitute coffee made from roasted grains, chicory, figs, acorns, anything that could be ground into a brown powder and called coffee. Goebbels' propaganda machine spun it as a virtue. Real Germans don't need foreign luxuries, the posters proclaimed. We are strong because we are self-sufficient. Coffee is a decadent weakness of the soft democracies. Anna's mother had believed it. She'd taught Anna to make Ersatzkaffee with pride. "This is what sacrifice looks like," she'd said, pouring the pale brown liquid that tasted like burnt dirt. "This is how we support our soldiers." By 1942, even ersatz was becoming scarce. The recipe changed monthly as ingredients ran out. Roasted barley, roasted rye, roasted chicory root when they could get it. Each version tasted worse than the last. Each version was a reminder that Germany was losing the war, even if nobody would say it out loud. What the German people didn't know was that America had been stockpiling coffee since before entering the war. The U.S. government, anticipating supply disruptions, had established relationships with coffee-growing nations throughout Latin America. Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica. By 1941, America was importing coffee at record levels, storing it in warehouses, ensuring that American soldiers and American civilians would never have to face the demoralization of coffee rationing. It was strategic. Coffee kept soldiers alert. Coffee maintained morale. Coffee was the fuel that powered the American war machine. But it was more than that. Coffee was a symbol of American abundance, of the productive capacity that made victory inevitable. Meanwhile, Anna was learning to extract flavor from roasted oak bark and calling it coffee. The contrast wasn't just about resources. It was about philosophy. The Nazi regime had built itself on a foundation of scarcity thinking. There wasn't enough for everyone, so the strong deserved to take from the weak. Germans deserved resources that Slavs and Jews didn't. Aryans were superior precisely because they could thrive while denying others. It was a zero-sum worldview. Every gain required someone else's loss. Every comfort required someone else's deprivation. America operated on a different principle. Abundance was possible. Production could expand. Everyone could have more without requiring others to have less. It wasn't about distributing scarcity. It was about creating surplus. This wasn't just about coffee. It was about two civilizations with fundamentally opposed beliefs about human potential and the nature of prosperity. And then, on May 8th, 1945, everything accelerated. VA Day. Germany surrendered, and suddenly millions of Germans were about to discover which philosophy was true. The American mess tent is chaos. Controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Anna stands in line with 300 other women, all of them former prisoners, all of them being processed for repatriation or resettlement. The Americans have set up stations, medical screening, documentation, delousing, food distribution. The food line is moving slowly. Anna can see the serving tables ahead. Real bread, not sawdust bread. Real bread, canned meat, vegetables, and at the end of the line, urns of coffee. Multiple urns. Massive urns. More coffee than she's seen in 5 years combined. An American woman in uniform at WWII. Anna will later learn his work in the coffee station. She's smiling. Actually smiling while ladling coffee into cups for enemy women. Anna had been taught that American women were either Hausfrauen like German women or masculine aberrations who'd abandoned their natural roles. This woman is neither. She's professional, confident, kind, and utterly comfortable in her authority. She hands Anna a cup. "Ere, you go." "Honey," she says in English that Anna doesn't understand but whose tone is unmistakable. Warmth without pity. Anna stares at the cup. at the dark liquid filled nearly to the brim, at the steam rising, at the impossible abundance of it. She'd expected punishment. She'd expected scarcity imposed by the victors on the defeated. She'd expected Americans to hoard their superior resources and force Germans to grovel for scraps. She found Americans acting like there was enough for everyone, like Sharon didn't diminish them, like her enemy status didn't make her unworthy of coffee. The smell is overwhelming. Rich. Complex. Nothing like the burnt grain smell of air. This smells like coffee smelled in her childhood. Before the war. Before rationing. Before everything good became a memory. She tastes Italiano, and the propaganda shatters. This isn't just coffee. It's proof. Undeniable, visceral proof that everything the Reich had told her was a lie. They'd said American abundance was a myth, that American prosperity was built on exploitation and would collapse under pressure, that the American system was decadent and weak. But this coffee, this real, abundant, freely given coffee was evidence of an economy so powerful it could afford to be generous, of a system so productive it didn't need to starve its enemies to feed its own. More, the WAC asks, seeing Anna's empty cup. Anna had drunk it so fast, trying to prove to herself it was real. Anna nods, unable to speak. The woman refills her cup without hesitation, without checking a ration card, without recording her name, without any of the bureaucratic machinery that had governed every resource distribution Anna had known for years. Just, here's more coffee. Because you want more. Because there's enough. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Germany, in hundreds of processing centers and displaced persons camps, the same revelation was spreading. American coffee was real. American abundance was real. And the implications were existential. In Mannheim, Greta finally tried the coffee after 3 days of refusing. She'd been a true believer, a party member who'd genuinely bought into the ideology. When she tasted the coffee, she understood that every speech she'd heard, every rally she'd attended, every certainty she'd held, was built on lies. They told us America was starving. She'd later write that their system was collapsing, that they were weak and degenerate. But that coffee told me everything I needed to know. They weren't starving. We were. In Frankfurt, a 15-year-old girl named Liesel tasted coffee for the first time in her life. She'd been too young to remember pre-war abundance. For her, ersatz was the only coffee she'd known. Real coffee was mythological. When she tasted it, she cried. Not from grief, from the sudden understanding that good things existed in the world. That she'd been raised in deprivation not because resources were naturally scarce, but because her nation had squandered them on conquest and atrocity. In Munich, in Stuttgart, in Nuremberg, in every city and town where American forces were processing prisoners and displaced persons, the coffee was doing what bombs couldn't, destroying the ideological foundation that had supported fascism. You can tell someone that abundance is possible. You can show them statistics. You can make arguments. But there's no argument as powerful as taste, as sensory proof, as the undeniable evidence of your own experience. The coffee wasn't just beverage. It was epistemology. It was the destruction of one worldview and the introduction of another, one bitter, dark, aromatic cup at a time. To understand how profound this was, we need to understand the infrastructure that made American coffee abundance possible. While Germany had been building concentration camps and military infrastructure, America had been building a different kind of system, a global supply chain designed to ensure that American forces never went without. The United States military consumed approximately 32 pounds of coffee per soldier per year, with millions of troops deployed globally. That meant importing, processing, storing, and distributing millions of pounds of coffee. The logistics were staggering, and they worked flawlessly, constantly. American soldiers drank coffee at breakfast, during breaks, after dinner, late at night on watch. They drank it from Italy to the Philippines, from North Africa to Western Europe, and they never ran out. But the system wasn't just about supply. It was about values. The U.S. military made a decision early in the war. Soldiers needed good morale to fight effectively. Good morale required comfort, and one of the most important comforts was coffee. So they didn't ration it. They didn't create a substitute. They ensured the real thing was always available, because soldiers who felt cared for fought better. Because treating people well created better outcomes than treating them as expendable. This was the fundamental difference. Germany had treated its own people as resources to be consumed in service of the state. America had treated its people as individuals whose well-being mattered, not from pure altruism. From pragmatic recognition that human beings perform better when they're treated like human beings. The coffee was evidence of this philosophy in liquid form. Most surprising were the American policies toward prisoners. The Geneva Conventions required minimal standards of care for people. America exceeded them. Consistently. Systematically. Not because they were required to, but because the American military ethos said that how you treated the powerless revealed who you were. German posts held in America during the war had been shocked to receive the same rations as American soldiers, the same coffee, the same food quality, the same medical care. Many gained weight in American captivity. Many later said they'd eaten better as prisoners in America than as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. This confused them. Their ideology said the strong dominated the weak. That victory meant taking everything and leaving nothing. But Americans had power and chose not to wield it cruelly. They had abundance and chose to share it. It didn't compute. Until it did. Until the cognitive dissonance became too great and the ideology cracked. Now, in the spring and summer of 1945, that same dynamic was playing out with civilians, with women who'd never been combatants, but had supported the war effort, with people who'd believed the propaganda and were now confronting undeniable evidence that the propaganda was false, and the coffee was the first crack in the wall, the first taste of a truth they'd been denied. Anna is on her third cup of coffee. She probably shouldn't drink more. Her stomach isn't used to real food, real coffee, anything real. But she can't stop. Every sip is a reclamation. Every sip is proof. She survived. Every sip tastes like a future that might be possible. The Vak, who's been serving coffee her Nachmittag, says Morrison, is watching Anna with something like concern. Easy there, she says, pantomiming, drinking slowly. You'll make yourself sick. Anna understands the gesture, if not the words. She nods, but she doesn't put the cup down. She's facing an impossible choice. Though she doesn't have words for it yet, she can hold on to her old beliefs that Germany was right, that the war was noble, that defeat was just temporary misfortune. Or she can accept what her senses are telling her. That she'd been living in a lie, that the America she'd been taught to hate was more humane than the Germany she'd been taught to love. Accepting that means accepting that her sacrifice is the years of hunger, the loss of her brother at Stalingrad, her father's death in a bombing raid, her own imprisonment were for nothing, were for a cause that was rotten at its core. Rejecting it means living in permanent cognitive dissonance, rejecting the evidence of her own experience. She drinks more coffee. She chooses truth, even though truth hurts worse than any physical wound. Later, she'll learn more about Private Morrison, about how she'd volunteered for the WACs against her father's wishes, about how she'd been stationed in England and then France and then Germany, about how she'd lost friends to German bombs and German bullets, about how she'd been injured in an attack on her convoy, and about how she still served coffee to German women with a smile. Not because she'd forgotten what Germany had done, but because she refused to let hatred make her smaller than she wanted to be. My grandmother was German, Morrison tells Anna weeks later, when Anna's English has improved enough for conversation. Came to America in 1920. She taught me to make flamencan and kartoffelsalat. She cried when the war started. Said her homeland had lost its mind. Morrison pauses, refilling Anna's cup. She was right, but she also taught me that nations do terrible things. People don't have to. People can choose differently. Anna processes this. The idea that German wasn't a fixed category. That being German didn't mean accepting what Germany had done. That identity could be more complicated than the Reich had allowed. 6 months ago, Anna had been certain of her place in the world, certain of her nation's righteousness, certain that sacrifice in service of the fatherland was the highest calling. Now, she couldn't imagine defending any of it. Couldn't imagine explaining to someone why coffee made from acorns was actually fine, why rationing was virtuous, why conquering your neighbors was justified. The coffee had shown her that certainty was often just ignorance that hadn't been challenged yet. But this knowledge came with a price that was becoming clearer every day. Anna had been repatriated to what remained of her hometown. Her house was rubble. Her family was scattered or dead, and she was one of the women who collaborated with Americans, which only meant she'd accepted help instead of starving from pride. Her neighbors looked at her differently. She'd been corrupted by American abundance. She'd forgotten German dignity. She'd traded her principles for coffee and sympathy. Anna tried to explain. The coffee wasn't a bribe. It was just coffee. The Americans were just being decent, but decency from the enemy was somehow more threatening than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could understand. Kindness broke their framework for making sense of the world. So Anna became an outsider in her own community. One of the women who'd seen too much, learned too much, changed too much. One of the women who couldn't go back to believing comfortable lies after tasting bitter truths. The coffee had liberated her, but liberation came with a cost. This wasn't happening only in Germany. The pattern was spreading wherever American forces were processing displaced persons and prisoners. In Austria, Katharina Hoffmann had been a secretary in the Nazi administration. She'd typed reports, filed papers, kept the bureaucracy running. She'd told herself she was just doing her job, that she wasn't responsible for what the words in her reports described. The American lieutenant who interviewed her, a Japanese-American from California who fought with the 442nd Regiment while his own family was in an internment. Camp gave her coffee while he took her statement. The cognitive dissonance was This man, whose people America had imprisoned, was treating her with more humanity than her own government had shown to anyone it deemed inferior. "I don't understand," she finally said in broken English. "Your people. ... your family. Why are you kind?" The lieutenant was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because someone has to break the cycle. Otherwise, we're all just taking turns being monsters." Katharina had never thought about it that way. She'd thought in terms of nations and loyalties and who deserved what. She hadn't considered that kindness could be a choice independent of whether it was deserved. The coffee in her hand suddenly felt heavier, like it carried the weight of a moral lesson she wasn't sure she wanted to learn. Not everyone welcomed this revelation. In a displaced persons camp near Salzburg, a group of women refused the American coffee on principle. They called it poison. They called the women who drank it traitors. They organized a resistance to American corruption. "We will not be bought with luxuries," their leader announced. "German women are strong. We don't need American charity." The protests lasted 4 days. Then the holdouts tasted the coffee. Then they quietly admitted that maybe strength didn't require suffering. Maybe dignity didn't require deprivation. Maybe you could accept help without losing yourself. For some, like Elizabeth Krause, the price was different. She'd been a resistance fighter, secretly opposing the Nazis, helping Jews escape, risking her life for years. She'd been arrested in 1944, survived interrogation, been sent to a work camp. When the Americans liberated her camp, they gave her coffee. Real coffee. The same coffee they gave to women who'd supported the regime. The same coffee they gave to everyone. "I was angry," she later wrote. "I'd resisted while others collaborated. I'd suffered while others prospered. And now we were all drinking the same coffee, being treated the same." Where was the justice? But over time, she understood. The coffee wasn't about justice. It was about humanity, about treating people like people, even when it would be easier not to. Even when differential treatment would be justified. "The Americans taught me something I hadn't learned in all my years of resistance," Elizabeth wrote. "That human dignity isn't something you earn through right action. It's something you have by virtue of being human. And a just society protects that dignity for everyone, even people who don't deserve it." The coffee was spreading a revolution. Not a political revolution, a psychological one. A revolution in understanding what societies could be, what humans could do for each other, what was possible when you rejected the philosophy of scarcity. The opposition to American abundance came from unexpected places. The Soviet authorities now occupying eastern Germany and parts of Austria, watched the American coffee policy with growing alarm. They'd been distributing basic rations to civilians in their zone, but nothing like the abundance Americans were offering. And the civilians were noticing. They were comparing. They were drawing conclusions about which system was actually superior. So, the Soviets launched a counter-propaganda campaign. American coffee was low quality. Americans were using food to manipulate Germans into accepting capitalism. The generosity was fake, designed to create dependency. Some Germans believed it, most didn't. You can't convince someone that what they're tasting isn't real when they're tasting it. In the American zone, military chaplains were having uncomfortable conversations with army leadership. Some felt that treating enemy civilians so well was inappropriate, that Germans needed to feel the consequences of what they'd supported, that generous coffee policy sent the wrong message. General Eisenhower disagreed. In a memo to his commanders, he wrote, "We are not here to punish civilians. We are here to rebuild a society that will never again threaten peace. That requires showing them that democratic societies can be both strong and generous. That abundance is possible. That human dignity is universal. If we can't demonstrate those principles in how we treat defeated enemies, we don't deserve to have one." The coffee policy continued. Even among Germans, there was resistance. Conservative voices argued that accepting American help was a form of defeat, that true Germans would rather starve than compromise their pride, that the women drinking American coffee were betraying German honor. But you can't shame someone into refusing coffee when they're hungry. You can't convince them that pride is more important than survival when survival suddenly seems possible. The moment came when Anna Weber found herself defending American coffee to her former neighbors. They'd cornered her at the well, where women still gathered to draw water since the municipal system was destroyed. They wanted to know why she was fraternizing with Americans, why she'd drunk their coffee, why she'd accepted their help. "Because I was thirsty," Anna said. "Because I was hungry. Because they offered." "You should have refused," Frau Muller said. She'd lost 2 sons in the war. Her grief had curdled into rigid principles. "German women don't beg from the enemy." "I didn't beg," Anna said. "They gave." "There's a difference." "There's no difference. Accepting makes you complicit." And then Anna saw it. Saw what she'd been unable to see before. That Frau Muller needed the Americans to be cruel. Needed them to be the enemy. Because if the Americans were actually decent, then maybe her sons had died for the wrong cause. Maybe the war had been pointless. Maybe the suffering had been avoidable. Frau Muller needed the Americans to be villains, because she needed her sacrifices to have meant something. The coffee was just coffee, Anna said quietly. It wasn't a political statement. It wasn't propaganda. It was just ... human. One person giving another person something good because they could, because they decided to. That's not how the world works, Frau Muller insisted. Maybe it could be, Anna said. She walked away from the well, away from the women who needed their enemies to act like enemies, away from the people who couldn't accept that kindness might be more powerful than cruelty. She walked back to the American distribution center and asked if they needed someone who spoke both German and English, someone who could help with documentation, someone who could bridge 2 worlds. They hired her the next day, paid her in American dollars, gave her a ration card that included coffee, real coffee, as much as she wanted. She'd chosen a side, not America over Germany, but abundance over scarcity, generosity over resentment, future over past. The coffee had taught her that those choices were possible. By August 1945, the statistics were clear. American occupation forces had distributed approximately 2.7 million pounds of coffee to German civilians in the first 3 months of peace. That was coffee given freely, not sold, given to people whose nation had just been defeated in war. The cost was minimal compared to other occupation expenses, but the impact was immeasurable. Remember Anna Weber, who'd cried into her first cup of American coffee. 2 years later, she was working as a translator for the Marshall Plan Office in She was helping coordinate the rebuilding of German infrastructure. She was part of the generation that would create the German economic miracle. She credited that first cup of coffee with teaching her a lesson she'd never learned in 12 years of Nazi education. That prosperity was a zero-sum game. That one person's abundance didn't require another's deprivation. That systems could be designed to create surplus rather than just distribute scarcity. The coffee was the first thing that made me believe rebuilding was possible, she'd say decades later. Because if the Americans could be that generous with their enemies, maybe generosity was the actual path to prosperity. Maybe the whole Nazi philosophy of taking and conquering and dominating was not just morally wrong but practically stupid. What seemed like a small kindness offering coffee to prisoners would eventually ripple through German society in unexpected ways. The women who'd accepted that coffee, who'd learned that abundance was possible, who'd seen that enemies could be decent, they raised children with different values. They taught their daughters that asking for help wasn't weakness. They taught their sons that sharing didn't diminish you. They taught the next generation that prosperity came from cooperation, not domination. The real heirs of this change were the children of the women who de-drunk American coffee in 1945. They grew up in a Germany that rejected militarism, that embraced democracy, that built a society founded on principles of human dignity and social cooperation. My mother told me about the coffee one of these children, now in his 70s, said in an interview, how it tasted like possibility, how it taught her that the world could be different than what she'd been told. I think about that every time I have coffee with friends from other countries, every time I participate in the European Union, every time I vote. The coffee my mother tasted in 1945 is part of why I grew up in a free Germany instead of another dictatorship. Today, Germany is one of America's closest allies. The nations that fought the bloodiest war in human history are now partners in promoting democracy, human rights, and international cooperation. Nobody credits coffee for this transformation, but the women who were there know better. They know that sometimes the most powerful interventions are the simplest, that sometimes dignity matters more than punishment, that sometimes generosity is the most strategic choice. There's a cafe in Stuttgart now, on the site of what used to be an American prisoner processing center. It's called Coffee and Frieden, Coffee and Peace. The owner is the granddaughter of a woman who was processed through that camp in 1945. On the wall is a photograph, a grainy black and white image of women in line, holding tin cups. The caption reads, "Where old worlds ended and new ones began. 1945. April 23, 1945. A prisoner processing center in Ludwigsburg, Germany. Anna Weber wrapping both hands around a tin cup of American coffee. That moment, 80 years ago, set in motion a transformation that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted. This wasn't just about female prisoners being shocked by the tastes of American coffee. It was about what happens when propaganda meets reality, when ideology confronts sensory experience, when the certainties you've been taught dissolve in the presence of undeniable truth. The coffee was a gift, but more than that, it was an education, a lesson in what becomes possible when you reject the philosophy of scarcity, when you choose to treat even your enemies as human beings, deserving of dignity. When you understand that true strength isn't demonstrated through cruelty, but through the capacity for generosity. Anna Weber lived until 2019. She died at 93, in her apartment in Stuttgart, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. In her kitchen, prominently displayed, was her coffee maker, an expensive one. She drank good coffee every morning of her adult life. Near the end, her granddaughter asked her why coffee was so important to her, why she'd spent money on good beans when cheaper options existed, why she took such pleasure in that morning ritual. Anna thought, for a long time, tense aside because the first real coffee I ever tasted taught me that good things are possible, that the world can be generous, that even in the worst moments, humanity survives. Every morning when I make coffee, I'm remembering that lesson. I'm honoring the kindness that saved me, and I'm reminding myself to pass it forward. The lesson wasn't just about coffee or abundance or American generosity. It was that small acts of humanity, consistently applied, can change the world. That the categories we use to divide people, enemy and friend, deserving and undeserving, us and them, are less real than our shared need for dignity, comfort, and connection. And that sometimes The most revolutionary thing you can do is simply recognize someone else's humanity and act accordingly, even when they're your enemy, even when you'd be justified in cruelty, even when kindness is the harder choice. One cup at a time, one person at a time, one choice at a time. That's how transformation happens. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the accumulation of small acts of decency that prove, again and again, that another way is possible. Anna Weber proved it. Private Morrison proved it. Thousands of American soldiers and millions of German civilians proved it. And the coffee that bitter, dark, impossibly generous coffee was the taste of a better world becoming real.